The bullies thought they were untouchable. Their parents ran the town. The community pretended not to see. But they made one critical mistake. They tormented an autistic child in front of Edward Wallace, and he's never forgotten what it feels like to be powerless. I pray that everyone who watches this video, subscribes, and leaves a comment will receive the very thing their heart has been searching for, whether it's peace, clarity, healing, or a breakthrough they've been waiting on. 8-year-old Carlos Robbins stood frozen in the center of Riverside Square in suburban Millbrook, hands clasped tightly together, waiting for his mother to return from the pharmacy across the street. The historic square, with its brick pathways, wrought iron benches, and Saturday farmers market, was supposed to be safe. His mother had said so. "Just wait right here, baby. I'll be 5 minutes." Carlos had counted to 300 twice already. The spring sunshine felt too bright. The conversations around him blurred into a wall of incomprehensible noise. A vendor's bell clanged somewhere behind him, and Carlos flinched, his shoulders rising toward his ears in an involuntary defensive posture. He didn't see Tony Brennan and his 2 friends approaching from behind the fountain. Being autistic meant reading social threats was nearly impossible, and by the time he sensed the danger, that predatory shift in the air around him, Gardner Mitchell had already blocked his path forward, and Haynes Robertson had circled to his left. The trap was complete before Carlos understood he was in one. Look who's out by himself. Tony's voice came too close, too loud. The words hitting Carlos like physical objects. Carlos flinched hard, his hands flying to his ears, the brown paper shopping bag slipping from his grip. Tony caught it mid-fall, with a theatrical flourish. "What's this? A toy?" He peered inside with exaggerated curiosity. "Aren't you a little old for toys, Robbins?" "Please." Carlos's voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper. His hands moved automatically into the specific pattern his therapist had taught him for calming down. Fingers tapping together in a rhythmic sequence, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but the stimming only made Gardner laugh. "Look, he's doing the weird thing with his hands." Gardner mimicked the motion with jerking, spastic movements that made Haynes snort. "What's wrong with you, freak? You broken?" Tony dangled the bag higher, just out of reach. "If you want it back, just ask nicely, like a normal person." Carlos tried. He really tried to form the words again, to make his mouth cooperate, but the sensory overload was already complete. The laughter felt like needles piercing his skin. The pointing fingers created phantom pressure points on his chest. The crowd's growing silence, all those adults deliberately not looking, was somehow worse than the noise. His legs trembled, his vision started to narrow into the tunnel darkness that meant a meltdown was coming. "He's gonna cry," Haynes announced, pulling out his phone with practiced ease. "Oh man, this is gonna be gold." Tony's grin widened. He upended the bag over the fountain, and Carlos watched his new sensory toy, the blue textured ball his mother had saved for 2 weeks to afford, plop into the chlorinated water. "Oops." Tony's voice dripped with mock sympathy. "Butterfingers." That's when the tears came. Silent, helpless, humiliating tears that traced clean lines down Carlos's flushed face, while 3 teenagers laughed, and one filmed it all. Carlos's hands were still tapping, faster now, desperately, the self-soothing mechanism failing completely as his nervous system went into full overload. He couldn't speak, couldn't run, couldn't even make his body move. Around the square, at least 24 adults continued their conversations, examined produce at the farmer's market, sipped their lattes at the coffee shop patio. A woman in yoga pants physically turned her back. A man in a business suit suddenly became very interested in his phone. The social contract of the wealthy suburban town held firm. Don't get involved, not your problem. Someone else will handle it. No one handled it. Tony pointed at Carlos's frantically tapping hands. Look, he can't even stop doing this stupid... Walk away. The voice cut through the square like a blade through silk, quiet, cold, and carrying the weight of absolute authority. Tony's smirk died instantly. Edward Wallace stood less than 3 feet behind him, and the teenager suddenly understood he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. The man was massive, not gym rat bulky, but legitimately powerful, the kind of build that came from real violence, not vanity. His black suit was probably worth more than Tony's father's car. His white shirt was crisp despite the spring heat. But it was the hands that made Tony's stomach drop. Tattoos crawled up from Edward's collar and wrapped around his neck in intricate, dark patterns. More ink covered his knuckles, the kinds of tattoos that told stories Tony didn't want to know. And those hands were currently clenched at Edward's sides, the only visible sign of the rage clearly coiling beneath the fastidious exterior. "I said walk away." Edward didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Right now. Gardner dropped his phone. The device clattered against the brick pathway, screen cracking. Haynes had already backed up 5 steps, eyes wide, all the earlier bravado evaporating like morning fog. But Tony, privileged, protected Tony Brennan, had been raised to believe his father's name was a shield. "Do you know who my father is?" The words came out with practiced arrogance, but Tony's voice shook slightly. "He works for Mr. Salieri. He runs this town. You don't want to—" Tony never finished the sentence. Edward moved with the kind of economy that comes from decades of practiced violence. No wasted motion, no theatrical display. He simply placed one massive hand on Tony's chest and moved him, 5 feet backward, effortlessly, like relocating a piece of furniture. Tony stumbled, caught himself, opened his mouth to protest, and met Edward's eyes. Whatever he saw there made him go pale. Gardner was already running. Haynes followed 2 seconds later, abandoning his friend without hesitation. Tony ran last, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape. The square fell silent. Edward turned, his expression softening by a single, barely perceptible degree, and looked down at Carlos. The boy was still frozen, tears still streaming, hands still tapping in that desperate, failing rhythm. His breath was coming in short, shallow gasps, the beginning of a full panic attack. Edward knew that look. God help him, he'd worn that look. He knelt slowly, carefully, making himself smaller, less threatening. When he spoke, his voice dropped to something almost gentle, a tone he hadn't used in 20 years. "Hey, Carlos, right?" Carlos's eyes flickered toward him, glassy with overwhelm. "My name is Edward." He kept his movements slow, telegraphed. "Those boys are gone. They're not coming back. Do you understand?" Carlos's hands kept tapping. Edward recognized the self-soothing mechanism. He'd seen it before, in another lifetime, in another boy who'd been cornered and broken. Without thinking, Edward reached out and placed his large, tattooed hand gently on Carlos's shoulder. Not restraining, just anchoring, providing pressure. The kind of deep pressure touch that sometimes helped. Carlos's breathing stuttered, then slowly began to even out. "That's it," Edward murmured. "Just breathe. You're safe now. I promise." Behind them, the square remained frozen. The Saturday shoppers were still studiously avoiding eye contact, but now their discomfort had a different source. The man in the expensive suit, the one with the prison tattoos and the bodyguards materializing from nowhere, had just intervened in something the entire town had chosen to ignore. And he'd done it with a tenderness that seemed completely at odds with the violence radiating from his very presence. Dominic Carver, Edward's chief of security, appeared at his employer's elbow like smoke. At 52, Dominic was lean, efficient, and utterly unflappable. He'd worked for Edward for 15 years and had learned to read his boss's moods like a combat veteran reads terrain. Right now, his boss was kneeling in a public square, comforting a crying child and radiating the kind of cold fury that usually preceded bodies disappearing into the Hudson River. "Sir," Dominic said quietly, "the property manager is waiting. The signing is scheduled for 3. "Cancel it." Dominic blinked. "Sir, the deal is time-sensitive. If we don't close today—" "I said cancel it." Edward didn't look up from Carlos. His hand remained steady on the boy's shoulder. "Clear my schedule for the next 4 hours. I want background checks on those 3 boys. Parents, addresses, financial records, criminal histories, if any. I want to know who they are, who protects them, and what leverage points exist. Understood. Dominic's eyes tracked across the square, noting positions, witnesses, potential problems. His gaze landed on a woman near the coffee shop, mid-30s, phone still raised, clearly having filmed the entire incident. Sir, we have a documentation problem. North corner, gray jacket. Edward's jaw tightened fractionally. Handle it, quietly. Dominic nodded and melted back into the small crowd. Edward focused on Carlos, whose breathing had finally stabilized into something resembling normal. The boy's hands had stopped their frantic tapping. His eyes, while still wet, had lost some of that glassy, overwhelmed quality. Where's your mother, Carlos? Carlos pointed toward the pharmacy with a shaking hand. Okay, we're going to wait right here until she comes back. Is that all right? Carlos nodded. A tiny, fragile movement. Edward stayed kneeling, his expensive suit be damned, one hand still providing that steady, grounding pressure on Carlos's shoulder. Around them, the square slowly began to resume its normal rhythm. Conversations restarted, vendors called their prices, the afternoon continued. But something fundamental had shifted. The wealthy suburban town of Millbrook had just learned that some of its cruelties had been witnessed, catalogued, and judged. The memory. Flashback. Queens, New York, 29 years earlier. 14-year-old Eddie Wallace pressed his back against the chain-link fence, tasting copper where his lip had split. 3 boys from the high school surrounded him, Marcus, Joey, and the one whose name Eddie could never remember, but whose fists he'd never forget. What's wrong, scholarship boy? Can't afford to fight back? Eddie's father, Vincent Wallace, wasn't a large man, wasn't particularly strong. He worked double shifts at the deli counter, kept his head down, paid his bills on time, and believed, genuinely believed, that hard work and honesty would protect his family. Vincent had come running when he heard the commotion, came running in his stained apron and his cheap sneakers, all 5'7" of him, to defend his son. Marcus had hit him first. Just one punch, but it was enough. Vincent went down hard, his glasses skittering across the concrete. Eddie remembered the laughter. The way Marcus had stood over his father's collapsed form and laughed. The way the crowd, there was always a crowd, had laughed. But worse than the laughter was the look on his father's face when he'd struggled back to his feet. The shame. The helplessness, the devastating understanding that his presence had made things worse, not better. Go home, old man, Marcus had said, still laughing, before you get hurt. Vincent had taken Eddie's hand and walked away. Walked away from the fight, from the humiliation, from his son's silent, shattering disappointment. Eddie never forgave him for walking away. Not even after Vincent died of a heart attack 3 years later. Probably brought on by working 80-hour weeks, trying to prove he was worth something. Not even after Eddie himself had become Edward Wallace, the man who never walked away, who never showed weakness, who built an empire on the simple principle that power was the only thing that mattered. Not even now. Edward blinked, pulled himself out of the memory by force of will. His hand was still on Carlos's shoulder. The boy was looking up at him now, really looking, with those intelligent, observant eyes that missed nothing. Carlos couldn't speak easily, but he could see. And whatever he saw in Edward's face made him reach out, hesitantly, carefully, and touch the back of Edward's hand. Just a touch. Nothing more. But it was enough. Edward felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd kept sealed for 29 years. The boy's simple, untainted gesture of trust and gratitude was more valuable than every dollar in Edward's offshore accounts, more powerful than every threat he'd ever made. Mr. Wallace? Dominic's voice was carefully neutral as he returned. In his hand was a phone, the woman's phone. The documentation has been secured. I've deleted the video and the cloud backup. The witness has been compensated for her understanding. Good. Edward's voice was rough. He cleared his throat. And the boys? Initial reports coming in now. Dominic pulled out his tablet, scrolling efficiently. Tony Brennan, 16. Father is Mitchell Brennan, runs a construction company and… Dominic paused, his expression shifting into something more serious. Is confirmed on Salieri's payroll, mid-level protection racket oversight. Edward's hand tightened fractionally on Carlos's shoulder before he consciously relaxed it. The boy didn't need to sense his rage. Salieri. Carlo Salieri ran the third-largest crime family in the tri-state area, smaller than Edward's organization, but vicious, territorial, and notoriously protective of his people. If Mitchell Brennan worked for Salieri, then this wasn't just about a kid being bullied. This was about territory, about respect, about the very careful boundaries Edward had spent 15 years establishing with the rival families. And Tony Brennan had just dragged his father's name, and by extension, Salieri's name, into a public humiliation in front of Edward Wallace himself. The other two? Edward's voice was perfectly calm, perfectly controlled, the kind of calm that made his own people nervous. Gardner Mitchell, 15. Father is Robert Mitchell, sits on the Town Planning Commission. Haynes Robertson, 16. Father is Lawrence Robertson, deputy prosecutor for the county. Of course they are. Edward's smile was thin and utterly devoid of warmth. Local power structure. The boys who can't be touched. Sir, Dominic's tone carried a warning. If we move on Brennan, Salieri will consider it a direct territorial challenge. The truce, Edward interrupted quietly, was built on mutual respect. Mitchell Brennan's son just pissed on that respect in the middle of a public square, and Salieri's man did it where I could see it, where I could witness it. Dominic understood immediately. In their world, being forced to witness something created obligation. Carlos's humiliation had happened in Edward's line of sight, which meant it had happened under his watch. If Edward did nothing, he looked weak. If he looked weak, everything he'd built would start to crumble. But there was something else in Edward's eyes that worried Dominic more than strategic calculations. This wasn't just business. This was personal. The mother. Carlos! The scream cut across the square, pure maternal terror compressed into 2 syllables. Sarah Robbins ran from the pharmacy, her purse swinging wildly, her face sheet white. She'd only been gone 12 minutes, but it had clearly been 11 minutes too long. Her eyes found her son first, then tracked to the massive, tattooed man kneeling beside him. Every protective instinct she possessed went into immediate overdrive. Get away from my son! Her voice shook, but she planted herself between Edward and Carlos like a sparrow defending its nest from a hawk. I don't know who you are, but… Mom! Carlos's voice was quiet, but clear. His first words since the attack. He helped me. The boys. They were mean. He made them stop. Sarah's eyes darted from Carlos to Edward to Dominic, who looked exactly like what he was, professional security, and back to Carlos. She was breathing hard, clearly trying to process the scene. Edward rose smoothly to his feet, creating physical distance, making himself less threatening. He brushed off his knees, a pointless gesture, the expensive fabric was already ruined from the brick, and met Sarah's eyes directly. Mrs. Robbins, he said quietly, my name is Edward Wallace. Your son was being harassed by 3 older boys. I intervened, that's all. That's all? Sarah's voice was incredulous. She pulled Carlos against her side, her hands running over him, checking for injuries with practiced efficiency. Who are you? Why are you… She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes catching on Edward's tattoos. The obvious quality of his suit, the security detail, the way people in the square were still giving them a wide berth. Understanding dawned slowly, followed immediately by fear. You're… She couldn't quite finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. A businessman, Edward supplied smoothly. I was here for a property acquisition. Wrong place, right time. He paused, then added with careful honesty. Your son deserved better than what those boys were doing. Someone needed to stop it. Sarah's grip on Carlos tightened. Thank you, but we're fine now. We'll just… The boys were filming him, Edward continued, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge now. For social media. One of my associates secured the footage before it could be posted. Your son won't be humiliated online. Sarah's expression shifted. Relief, then confusion, then a deeper, more analytical fear. You deleted a video? How did you? She stopped herself, clearly deciding she didn't want to know. Look, Mr. Wallace, I appreciate the help, but I think it's best if we just go. The main bully, Edward interrupted gently, said his father works for Mr. Salieri. Sarah went very still. Even in suburban Millbrook, that name meant something. He mentioned this after I intervened, Edward continued, which makes this situation more complicated than a simple schoolyard incident. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know that these boys may not consider the matter closed. It was a careful truth, wrapped in a protective lie. The boys were terrified and wouldn't come near Carlos again. But Sarah needed to understand the landscape, needed to know why Edward couldn't just walk away now. Because walking away had never solved anything. What are you saying? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm saying, Edward replied, meeting her eyes with absolute sincerity, that I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again, to Carlos or anyone else. And I'm saying that if those boys or their families try to retaliate in any way, you call this number immediately. He pulled a business card from his inner pocket. Expensive stock, minimal text, just a phone number and the name E. Wallace Enterprises. Sarah took the card like it might burn her. I don't want my son involved in whatever this is. He already is, Edward said quietly. Through no fault of his own. I'm just making sure he's on the protected side of the equation. Sarah looked down at Carlos, who was calmer now, leaning into her side, his hands doing a gentle, rhythmic tap against his leg, self-soothing but manageable. Then she looked back at Edward, at this dangerous man in his expensive suit who'd knelt in the dirt to comfort her son. Why? She asked simply. Why do you care? Edward was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds. Because someone should have cared when I was his age, and no one did. Sarah studied his face, seeing past the tattoos and the obvious danger to something raw underneath. Finally, she nodded once. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wallace. Edward, he corrected gently, and you're welcome. 20 minutes later, Edward sat in the back of his armored Mercedes, watching Riverside Square disappear in the rearview mirror. Dominic was driving, silent, giving his boss space to think. Edward's reflection stared back at him from the tinted window, 43 years old, hundreds of millions in assets, enough power to make problems disappear with a phone call, and still carrying the face of that 14-year-old boy who'd watched his father get humiliated. That look, Edward said quietly, more to himself than to Dominic. The exact same look. Sir? Carlos, when those boys were circling him, that paralyzed, helpless terror. Edward's hands clenched into fists on his thighs. My father had that look the day Marcus hit him, the day he realized he couldn't protect me. The day he understood his honesty and hard work meant nothing against real cruelty. Dominic said nothing. He'd known Edward long enough to recognize when his boss needed to talk. He walked away that day, Edward continued. My father. He just walked away, took my hand and walked away while they laughed, and I hated him for it. Hated him for being weak, for not fighting, for not being enough. Edward's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He died thinking I still hated him. 3 years later, heart attack, probably from working himself to death trying to prove he was worth something. And I never told him I understood. That walking away was probably the bravest thing he could have done, because staying would have gotten us both killed. But you're not walking away, Dominic observed carefully. No. Edward's reflection smiled, sharp and cold. I'm not. Because I'm not my father. I have the power he never had. The resources. The reach. He turned away from the window, his expression hardening into something calculating and ruthless. And I'm going to use every single ounce of it to make sure Carlos Robbins never feels that helpless again. Sir, the Salieri situation is about to become Mitchell Brennan's problem, not mine. Edward pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts with practiced efficiency. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to do a full forensic accounting on Brennan's construction company. I want every permit violation, every safety shortcut, every dollar he skimmed from Salieri. We're going to build a file so comprehensive that Carlo Salieri himself will thank us for bringing it to his attention. Dominic's eyes widened fractionally. You're going to give Salieri his own man? I'm going to give Salieri a liability who got exposed operating in my territory. Mitchell Brennan's son invoked Salieri's name in front of witnesses while committing a public assault. That makes Brennan sloppy, dangerous, the kind of weak link that brings law enforcement attention. And Salieri hates weak links, Dominic finished. Exactly. Edward's smile had no warmth in it whatsoever. By Monday morning, Mitchell Brennan will cease to be Salieri's problem and will become Salieri's example. The man will be lucky if he just loses his business. If he's unlucky, he loses much more. What about the other two fathers, the commissioner and the prosecutor? Edward's expression shifted into something even colder. Those are the ones I'm handling personally. They enabled this. They created an environment where their sons believed they were untouchable. That ends now. He pulled up a number. Let it ring twice before a crisp voice answered. Wallace, I need a meeting with the governor's office. Monday morning. Yes, I know it's short notice. Tell them I have information about corruption in Millbrook's Planning Commission and prosecutor's office that needs immediate attention, campaign contribution level attention. He ended the call and made another. Marcus, Edward Wallace, I need you to pull building permits for all residential developments in Millbrook for the last 5 years. Cross-reference with Planning Commission votes? Yes, I'm looking for a pattern of favoritism. Mitchell on the commission. I need it by Sunday night. Call after call, each one precise, targeted, building a web of pressure and exposure that would systematically dismantle the protection those boys had enjoyed. Dominic watched his boss work with something approaching awe. This was Edward Wallace at his most dangerous, not the man who ordered violence, but the man who orchestrated systematic destruction with paperwork and phone calls. Sir, Dominic said quietly when Edward finally paused, this is going to be expensive. The time, the resources, the political capital you're spending. I don't care. And it's going to draw attention, the kind of attention we usually avoid. I don't care. Edward's voice was flat, absolute. That boy stood in a public square and cried while 24 adults did nothing. His mother works nursing shifts and saves for weeks to buy him a sensory toy. He can't defend himself, can't call for help, can't even explain what happened to him. Edward leaned forward, his eyes locked on Dominic's in the rearview mirror. I'm not walking away. Not this time. Not while I have the power to actually do something. Those 3 boys are going to learn that cruelty has consequences. Their fathers are going to learn that protection has limits. And this goddamn town is going to learn that some people, even people like me, draw a line. Dominic held his boss's gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Understood, sir. I'll coordinate the teams. Good. Edward leaned back against the leather seat, his expression settling into something carved from granite. Because in 72 hours, Millbrook is going to understand that they humiliated the wrong child in front of the wrong man. He pulled out his phone one more time, opened a new note, and typed a single sentence. A promise to himself, to the ghost of his father, and to a small boy who'd touched the back of his hand with simple trust. Not while I'm here. By the time Edward's car reached the interstate, 3 things had already been set in motion. First, a forensic accounting team in Manhattan had begun the deep dive into Mitchell Brennan's construction company, flagging irregularities that would make the IRS very, very interested. Second, a private investigator in Millbrook had received a retainer and a target list: Robert Mitchell's Planning Commission votes, Lawrence Robertson's case dismissal patterns, and any connection between the two that smelled of corruption. Third, and most importantly, a carefully worded message had been sent through back channels to Carlo Salieri's organization, a professional courtesy from one crime boss to another, noting that Mitchell Brennan's son had publicly invoked Salieri's name during an incident that was now being investigated by multiple parties. The message was clear. Your man is sloppy, and the sloppiness is happening in my territory. Handle it, or I will. By Monday morning, Mitchell Brennan would have much bigger problems than his son's behavior. By Tuesday, the planning commissioner and deputy prosecutor would be drowning in state ethics investigations. And by Wednesday, 3 teenage boys would understand that their parents' protection had evaporated like morning dew. Edward Wallace didn't make threats. He made problems disappear. And right now, the biggest problem in Millbrook was the systematic cruelty that had been allowed to flourish in a wealthy, comfortable town that preferred to look away. That was about to change, permanently. The silence in the town square felt thick enough to choke on. Edward's hand remained steady on Carlos's shoulder, but his eyes swept the crowd with the methodical precision of a man cataloging threats. The bullies stood frozen, Tony clutching his bleeding nose while his friends backed away like rats sensing a trap. Carlos trembled beneath Edward's palm, small and vulnerable in a way that made something ancient twist in Edward's chest. The boy didn't understand what he'd just witnessed. The calculated brutality, the surgical application of force. He only knew his father had come and the monsters had scattered, but the monsters weren't finished. "You're gonna regret that!" Tony's voice cracked, teenage bravado fighting through pain and humiliation. Blood ran between his fingers, painting his lips red. "My dad runs this town. He works for Mr. Salieri." The name hit Edward like a gunshot. His professional mask, that careful arrangement of concerned father, crumbled. Salieri. The rival syndicate had been testing boundaries for months, pushing into territory Edward's organization had controlled for a decade. Small provocations, strategic encroachments, and now this, the son of a Salieri lieutenant terrorizing his boy on what should have been neutral ground. This wasn't bullying. This was reconnaissance, or worse, a message. Edward's mind raced through calculations. Tony's father would hear about this within the hour. The confrontation would be interpreted as an act of aggression, regardless of the circumstances. The boy had just handed Edward a problem that couldn't be solved with fists or fear. He forced his face back into neutral territory, but his jaw ached from clenching. "Go home," he said quietly to Tony, "and tell your father, Edward Castellano sends his regards." Let the name land where it would. Better the boy understood whose son he'd been targeting. Tony's remaining courage evaporated. He stumbled backward, his friends already running, and fled toward the side streets with the desperate speed of someone who'd just realized they'd grabbed a live wire. The crowd began to disperse, that peculiar amnesia that settled over witnesses who knew better than to remember. But Edward's trained eye caught the anomaly immediately, a woman across the square, 40-something with nervous hands, fumbling with her phone. The angle was wrong, the timing too perfect. She'd been recording. His pulse stayed steady, but his mind marked her as the evening's second crisis. Evidence was leverage, and leverage in the wrong hands became a noose. A shadow materialized at his elbow. Dominic, 6 feet of controlled violence wrapped in an expensive suit, moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent 20 years as Edward's right hand. He didn't need orders. He never did. "Take Carlos to the car," Edward murmured, "then handle the woman, gently. Accident report protocol." Dominic nodded once, already moving. He scooped Carlos up with surprising tenderness, murmuring reassurances Edward couldn't hear. The boy clung to him, exhausted from adrenaline and confusion. Edward watched Dominic cross the square toward the woman, his approach calibrated to project authority without threat. She noticed him too late, already pocketing her phone. The conversation would be brief, professional, and utterly irreversible. The phone would disappear. The woman would understand, on some primal level, that certain things were better forgotten. 5 minutes later, Edward settled into the armored car's leather seat, the reinforced door closing with a vault-like thunk. His reflection stared back from the tinted window, still handsome, still composed, but with something cold and ancient swimming behind his eyes. Carlos sat beside him, silent now, processing. Dominic slid into the driver's seat, the woman's phone already in a signal-blocking bag. Edward studied his own face, seeing the truth beneath the costume. Protective father, brutal killer. The roles bled together until the seams disappeared. "This isn't just about a kid," he said, his voice flat with certainty. "It's about a weak link in Salieri's operation. A lieutenant careless enough to let his son run wild on our streets." He turned from the window, meeting Dominic's eyes in the rear-view mirror. "We're cutting out the rot." Dominic's expression didn't change. "When?" "Soon." Edward's hand found Carlos's shoulder again, gentler now. "But first, we make sure my son never has to fight his own battles again." The car pulled away from the square, leaving nothing behind but bloodstains and selective memory. The files arrived before midnight, delivered by courier to Edward's private study. Dominic had worked fast, 3 folders, each containing the blueprint of a life about to be dismantled. Edward spread them across his mahogany desk like a general surveying a battlefield. The lamp cast harsh shadows across photographs, financial records, and surveillance reports compiled with the thoroughness of a man who understood that information was the sharpest weapon. Tony's father, first, Vincent Marcuso. Mid-level enforcer for Salieri's organization, masquerading as the owner of a commercial cleaning company. The business was real enough, contracts with city buildings, schools, a few restaurants. But the revenue streams told a different story. Protection money laundered through invoicing, kickbacks from construction sites, small rackets that added up to comfortable suburban living, and enough arrogance to let his son terrorize other children without consequence. Edward's finger traced the connections, finding the weak points. Tax irregularities, OSHA violations. A contract renewal coming up with the school district that depended on staying in good standing with certain officials. Officials like Gardner and Haynes. The second and third folders revealed the enabling architecture. James Gardner, city councilman, father to one of Tony's lieutenants. Clean on the surface, but Dominic had found the rot. Unreported campaign contributions, a mistress on the municipal payroll, ties to Salieri's legitimate businesses that blurred into illegitimate arrangements. Robert Haynes, deputy superintendent of schools, the man who'd ignored every complaint about the bullying, who'd dismissed concerned teachers and told Carlos's previous school to handle it internally. His folder was thinner but damning, a gambling problem, debts to a bookmaker who reported directly to Salieri's money man. Edward leaned back, fingers steepled, constructing the elimination in his mind. No blood, no bodies. Just the systematic destruction of power structures that had allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. "Marcuso's cleaning contracts evaporate," he said aloud, though Dominic stood silent in the corner. Anonymous tip to the IRS about his accounting irregularities. Another to the labor board about worker misclassification. The business collapses. Salieri loses patience with an enforcer who can't keep his operations clean. Dominic nodded, already taking mental notes. Gardner loses his seat. We fund his opponent, leak the mistress story to the local paper. Frame it as fiscal irresponsibility, taxpayer money wasted on personal affairs. He's finished before the election. "And Haynes?" Dominic's voice was gravel and smoke. "His debts get called in, publicly. The bookmaker applies pressure he can't ignore. And when he breaks," Edward smiled without warmth, "we make sure the school board knows about his gambling problem and his financial entanglements with local criminals. He resigns in disgrace or gets fired. Either works." The plan was elegant, ruthless, and entirely legal. No one would die. They would simply cease to matter. But as Edward closed the folders, something cracked in his carefully maintained composure. His hands trembled. Just slightly. Just enough. The day's adrenaline had finally worn off, leaving only the raw wound beneath. "It's late," Dominic said quietly. "You should rest." "I can't." Edward's voice came out hoarse. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey, drank it in one burning swallow. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him. My father." Dominic waited. 20 years of friendship had taught him when silence was service. "I was 9, Edward continued, staring at his glass. "Smaller than Carlos. There were 4 of them, bigger kids from the north side. They'd take my lunch money, shove me into lockers, make me eat dirt during recess. His jaw clenched. My father found out. He was a good man, Dom. Honest. Worked at the print shop, never hurt anyone in his life. The memory played behind Edward's eyes like a film he couldn't stop watching. He confronted their fathers at the bar where they drank, begged them, actually begged, to make their sons stop. And they laughed at him, called him weak, said boys would be boys. Edward's voice dropped to something barely human. Then they beat him, right there in front of everyone, broke his nose, cracked 2 ribs. He came home bloodied and humiliated. And I watched him try to explain to my mother why he couldn't protect his own son. Edward, he died 6 months later. Heart attack, the doctor said. But I knew better. They broke something in him that night. The humiliation killed him slower than their fists ever could. The silence stretched, heavy with old ghosts. No child will feel what I felt, Edward said, his voice hardening into something like scripture. That helplessness, that shame, and no father will fail the way mine failed. Not because he was weak, but because the world is built to protect bullies and crush the honest. He looked up at Dominic, and his eyes held the cold certainty of a man who'd transformed trauma into doctrine. We start tomorrow. By the end of the month, those 3 men won't have the power to protect anyone. Not their sons. Not themselves. Dominic nodded once. Consider it done. Edward's downtown office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower that bore his family name in discreet bronze letters. From his desk, he could see the entire city spread beneath him like a game board, each district a territory, each building a piece in play. Today, he was moving his queen. Gentlemen, Edward addressed the 6 analysts gathered around his conference table, the Riverside development is postponed. Effective immediately, you work for me on a single target. Michael Chen, his senior financial investigator, blinked in confusion. Sir, the Riverside deal closes in 3 weeks. We're talking about 40 million in I'm aware of the numbers, Michael. Edward's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Vincent Marcuso is now your sole priority. I want every dollar traced, every transaction mapped, every shell company exposed. You have 72 hours. The team exchanged glances but didn't argue. They'd learned long ago that Edward Castellano didn't make requests. He issued prophecies that his organization then brought to life. Edward slid a thin folder across the polished table. This is what we know. Marcuso runs his cleaning company as a front for Salieri's street-level operations. Protection money, kickbacks from union contracts, skimming from city maintenance budgets. He's careful, but not careful enough. Jennifer Park, his tax specialist, opened the folder and began scanning. Her eyebrows rose. These bank deposits don't match his reported business income, not even close. Exactly. He's been laundering through his legitimate operation for years, but he's gotten sloppy, overconfident. Edward pulled up a financial diagram on the wall screen, lines connecting accounts across 3 states and 2 offshore jurisdictions. Follow the money backward. I want the complete architecture of his operation. Every LLC, every numbered account, every false invoice. For the next 3 days, Edward's team worked with the focused intensity of surgeons performing a delicate operation. They traced cash flows through a labyrinth of shell companies, Marcuso's cleaning business paying inflated invoices to a Delaware-registered consulting firm, which then funneled money to a Caribbean account, which looped back through a real estate investment trust that purchased properties for Salieri's lieutenants at suspiciously favorable prices. Edward watched the pattern emerge on his screens like a constellation, becoming visible in a darkening sky. Marcuso had been clever, but he'd made the fatal mistake of thinking himself invisible. He'd underestimated the resources that could be brought to bear by a man with Edward's reach and motivation. Here, Michael said on the 3rd morning, pointing to a series of transactions. He's claiming business expenses that don't exist, equipment purchases from vendors that went defunct years ago. He's been filing fraudulent tax returns for at least 5 years. How much exposure? Edward asked. Criminal tax evasion. We're talking federal charges, potential prison time. The IRS would be very interested in this. Edward smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Prepare 3 packets, identical documentation, different audiences. The first packet went to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, delivered anonymously through an encrypted tip line. Tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering. The evidence presented itself with the pristine clarity of mathematical proof. The second went to the State Licensing Board, documenting how Marcuso's cleaning company had fraudulently obtained and maintained its commercial certifications while engaging in criminal activity. The business licenses would be revoked within weeks. The third packet was the most delicate. Edward had it compiled with additional information, bank records showing Marcuso had been skimming from Salieri's operations, taking more than his share from protection payments, hiding income from his own organization. The documentation was circumstantial, but damning. Designed to raise questions that paranoid men like Salieri would need answered. This packet arrived on the desk of Frank Moretti, Salieri's consigliere, through channels that made it appear to come from within their own organization. Internal treachery was the most unforgivable sin in their world. "One more thing," Edward said as his team prepared to disperse. "I need a media strategy." Jennifer looked confused. "For what?" "For protection." Edward pulled up a different file, this one containing carefully curated information about a struggling single mother named Sarah Chen who'd been raising her son Carlos alone after her husband's death in a construction accident, working 2 jobs, volunteering at the school, fighting to give her child opportunities she'd never had. "This woman," Edward said, pointing to Sarah's photograph, "is going to be a local hero. I want positive press, human interest stories about resilience and determination. Anonymous donations to the school's scholarship fund in her name, community recognition for her volunteer work. By the time the Marcuso story breaks, I want her positioned as everything a parent should be." "Why?" Michael asked. Edward's expression was unreadable. "Because when powerful men fall, they look for scapegoats. They'll try to blame the people who exposed them, the witnesses who spoke up. Sarah recorded what happened in the square. When Marcuso's world collapses, he'll be looking for someone to hurt." He closed the file with quiet finality. "She's going to be too visible, too sympathetic, too protected by public opinion for him to touch." The packets were delivered by Friday. Edward sat in his office that evening, watching the sun set over the city, and imagined the chaos beginning to unfold in 3 separate locations. At the IRS office, agents opening an envelope that would launch an investigation. At the licensing board, bureaucrats discovering violations that demanded immediate action. And somewhere in Salieri's organization, Frank Moretti reading documents that would make him question Vincent Marcuso's loyalty. The weapon had been fired. Now Edward simply had to wait for the target to fall. The first domino fell at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Edward sat in a rented office 3 blocks from his tower, watching 6 different news feeds on monitors arranged in a semicircle. The location was deliberate, anonymous, temporary, insulated from any connection to what was about to unfold. Dominic stood behind him, arms crossed, silent as a monument. The breaking news banner appeared first on the local station. Federal investigation launched into local business owner. Vincent Marcuso's face filled the screen. A posed photograph from his company website, confident smile now rendered ironic by the crawl of accusations beneath it. Tax evasion, money laundering, fraudulent business practices. Edward watched without expression as the reporter detailed the IRS raid that had begun at dawn. Federal agents and windbreakers, carrying boxes from Marcuso's office. His cleaning company's headquarters cordoned off with yellow tape. Employees standing in the parking lot, confused and suddenly unemployed. The second monitor showed the financial cascade in real time. Edward's analysts had provided him with access to the relevant systems, not illegal access, simply the kind of visibility that money and connections could purchase. Marcuso's business accounts froze at 10:03 a.m. His personal accounts followed 17 minutes later. The electronic infrastructure of his life simply stopped. By 10:30, the state licensing board's announcement hit. Marcuso Cleaning Services commercial licenses suspended pending investigation. every contract nullified, every city building, every school, every restaurant that had employed his services now scrambling for replacements. Edward sipped his coffee. Room temperature now, bitter, he didn't notice. The third act began at 11:15 a.m., and this one played out beyond the reach of cameras. Dominic's phone buzzed, a text from one of their watchers positioned near Marcuso's home in the suburbs. Edward read it over his shoulder. 2 black SUVs, 4 men. Salieri's crew. This was the most delicate domino, the one that required no push from Edward, only the careful arrangement of information that would cause other men to act according to their nature. Salieri's organization had received the packet suggesting Marcuso had been skimming, hiding income, possibly preparing to cooperate with federal authorities to save himself. In their world, the arithmetic was simple. Investigation plus hidden money equaled rat. Edward's watcher sent updates every few minutes. The men entering Marcuso's house, shouting visible through windows. Marcuso emerging 20 minutes later, face pale, flanked by Salieri's enforcers. Not arrested, that would come from the government. This was something else, a summons, a reckoning. He won't be killed, Dominic observed quietly. No, Edward agreed. Salieri is smarter than that. Too much federal attention already, but Marcuso's protection is gone, his income is gone, his reputation is gone. By tomorrow, he'll be begging to cooperate with prosecutors just to survive. The afternoon brought the downstream effects, the smaller dominoes toppling in sequence. Gardner's campaign office released a statement at 2 p.m. The councilman was taking time to address personal matters and withdrawing from the upcoming election. Edward's opposition research had been leaked to 3 newspapers simultaneously that morning: The Mistress, the unreported contributions, the financial entanglements with Marcuso's now toxic business network. Haynes lasted until 4 p.m. before the school board placed him on administrative leave. His gambling debts had been called in publicly, a coordinated move that ensured his creditors, themselves connected to Salieri's organization, would make noise. The superintendent had no choice but to suspend him pending investigation. 3 men, 3 lives dismantled. The execution had taken less than 7 hours. Edward closed his laptop and stood, stretching muscles that had been tensed for hours without him noticing. Time to go home. Carlos? Dominic asked. I'll pick him up from school myself today. The next morning, Edward watched from his car as Carlos approached the school entrance. The boy walked taller now, head up, shoulders back. The fear that had hunched him into himself for months had begun to dissipate. Tony emerged from a different car, his mother's sedan, not his father's luxury vehicle. The boy looked smaller somehow, diminished. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he kept his head down as he walked past clusters of students who whispered and pointed. Gardner's son stood alone near the bike racks, previously expensive sneakers now looking shabby against the backdrop of his family's public humiliation. No one approached him. The social currency of having a father on the city council had evaporated overnight. Haynes's daughter sat on the front steps, scrolling through her phone with the desperate intensity of someone avoiding eye contact. Her friends, the popular crowd she'd ruled with casual cruelty, had reformed into a tighter circle that no longer included her. The predators had become prey. Not through violence, but through the simple withdrawal of the power structures that had enabled their cruelty. Carlos glanced back at the car, caught Edward's eye and smiled. Tentative, but genuine. Then he walked into school without looking over his shoulder. Edward felt nothing watching the scene unfold. No satisfaction, no triumph, no guilt. This was simply correction, the restoration of proper order. He'd identified a threat to his son and eliminated it with the same clinical efficiency he'd apply to any business problem. You want me to keep monitoring? Dominic asked from the driver's seat. For another week. Make sure there's no retaliation attempt. Edward checked his watch. Then we can return to normal operations. As they pulled away from the school, Edward's phone buzzed with a news alert. Marcuso had been formally charged with federal tax evasion, bond set at $2 million, unable to post bail due to frozen assets. Edward deleted the notification and opened his email. The Riverside development deal awaited his attention. $40 million of legitimate business that had been delayed for this necessary detour. He began typing responses to his team, thoughts already shifting to the next quarter's projections. The takedown of 3 men and the protection of his son occupied the same mental space as any other successfully completed project. Filed away, lessons extracted, then released from active consideration. Dominic glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You sleep okay last night?" "Fine," Edward lied. He'd lain awake until 3 a.m., not from conscience, but from the meticulous mental review of every step in the operation, searching for loose ends, potential exposure, vectors of blowback. He'd found none. The operation had been perfect, surgical, clean, utterly deniable. Just necessary maintenance on a system that had briefly malfunctioned. Sarah Robbins stood in her kitchen at 6 a.m., hands trembling as she poured her 3rd cup of coffee. The local news played on the small television mounted under the cabinet, and for the 3rd morning in a row, Vincent Marcuso's face filled the screen. Federal charges, frozen assets, ties to organized crime. She'd watched the man's son terrorize Carlos for months. She'd filed complaints with the school, spoken to teachers, even tried to approach Tony's mother at a PTA meeting, only to be dismissed with barely concealed contempt. The Marcuso family had been untouchable, insulated by money and connections Sarah couldn't comprehend. Now they were destroyed. She should have felt relief. Victory, even. Instead, a cold dread had settled in her stomach and refused to leave. Carlos shuffled into the kitchen, already dressed for school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked better, sleeping through the night now, eating breakfast without her having to coax him. The hunted expression that had haunted his eyes for months had faded. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, baby." She forced a smile, set a bowl of cereal in front of him. "How are you feeling about school?" "Good." He said it simply, without the careful consideration that used to precede his answers. "Tony doesn't even look at me anymore. None of them do." That was what frightened her, the sudden, complete reversal. Bullies didn't just stop. Not like this. Not all at once, with their entire families imploding simultaneously. "Carlos, honey," about what happened in the square. She sat across from him, trying to find the right words. "The man who helped you, did you recognize him?" Carlos shook his head, mouth full of cereal. "He said he was just passing through. But he was really strong, Mom. And everyone was scared of him." Everyone should have been scared. Sarah had watched the video on her phone 50 times before that well-dressed man, Dominic, he'd said his name was, had taken it from her with apologies about accident reports and insurance protocols. She'd been too shocked to argue. The man in the square hadn't just stopped the bullies. He'd moved with the controlled violence of someone for whom brutality was a familiar tool. And then he'd looked directly at her camera, and she'd felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. She'd been getting them all week, reporters mostly, wanting to talk about the incident, about Marcuso's arrest, about the sudden collapse of several prominent local families. She let it go to voicemail. The news shifted to a new story. City Councilman James Gardner announcing his resignation amid allegations of corruption and misuse of public funds. His face appeared on screen, gray and defeated, reading a prepared statement about spending more time with family. Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee mug. Gardner's son had been one of Tony's accomplices, one of the boys who'd laughed while Carlos was shoved into the dirt. The segment continued. Deputy Superintendent Robert Haynes placed on indefinite administrative leave pending investigation into financial improprieties and dereliction of duty. Haynes. The man who'd told her there was insufficient evidence to take action against the bullying, who'd suggested Carlos was too sensitive and needed to toughen up. 3 families, 3 simultaneous implosions, all connected to the boys who'd tormented her son. This wasn't coincidence, this was something else, something deliberate and terrifying in its precision. Carlos finished his breakfast, oblivious to his mother's spiraling thoughts. "Can Jake come over this weekend?" He asked if we could play video games. Jake. a boy who'd never spoken to Carlos before last week, now suddenly friendly. Sarah wondered if that was genuine or just the social recalibration that happened when power structures shifted. We'll see, baby. After Carlos left for school, Sarah sat in the silence of her kitchen and stared at her phone. 7 missed calls. 12 unread messages. She scrolled through them mechanically. Reporters, concerned neighbors, her sister asking if she'd seen the news, and one message from a number with a New York area code. Ms. Robbins, please call regarding a legal matter of interest. Thompson and Associates. She almost deleted it, almost, but something made her dial the number. Thompson and Associates, how may I direct your call? Professional, neutral, giving nothing away. I received a message from this number. My name is Sarah Robbins. One moment, please. The hold music was classical, expensive sounding. Sarah's heart hammered. Ms. Robbins, thank you for returning our call. A man's voice, cultured and careful. My name is Richard Thompson. I represent a client who wishes to remain anonymous but has taken an interest in your family's well-being. I don't understand. Your son Carlos was involved in an unfortunate incident last week. My client believes you and your son suffered damages, emotional distress, potential threats to your safety, and wishes to provide compensation. Sarah's mouth went dry. Who is your client? As I said, they wish to remain anonymous, but they're prepared to offer a substantial settlement, $500,000, along with assistance relocating to a community with excellent schools and comprehensive security. The number hit her like a slap. $500,000. More money than she'd earn in 10 years at her current jobs. This is because of the video, she said quietly. Because I recorded what happened. Thompson's pause was meaningful. My client is concerned for your safety, Miss Robbins. The Marcuso family had extensive connections. While Mr. Marcuso is currently facing federal charges, there remain associates who might view your testimony as problematic. I haven't testified to anything. Not yet. But you possess evidence of an assault, evidence that could be subpoenaed. My client wishes to ensure you and Carlos are protected, comfortable, and able to move forward with your lives without fear. Sarah's hands shook. This was a bribe, or witness tampering, or something worse she didn't have words for. But it was also a lifeline. Carlos could go to a better school, somewhere safe. She could stop working 2 jobs, be present for her son instead of perpetually exhausted. They could disappear from this town and its suddenly dangerous politics. I need time to think. Of course, but Ms. Robbins? Thompson's voice dropped, became gentle in a way that was somehow more frightening than threats. My client is very interested in your well-being. However, there are others who might be less benevolent in their interest. I'd encourage you to make a decision quickly, for Carlos's sake. The line went dead. Sarah sat motionless, phone still pressed to her ear, understanding with perfect clarity that she'd just been offered a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Take the money and disappear, protected by whoever had dismantled 3 families in less than a week, or refuse, and face whatever came next alone. She thought of Carlos's smile that morning, the first genuine smile she'd seen in months. She thought of the man in the square, his hand on her son's shoulder, his eyes promising violence to anyone who threatened what he'd claimed as his to protect. And she wondered, with creeping horror, what kind of protection came with strings she couldn't see yet. The office Richard Thompson had arranged was neutral territory, a conference room in a downtown hotel, anonymous and temporary. Edward arrived 15 minutes early, as he always did, and positioned himself facing the door. He'd dressed carefully, charcoal suit, white shirt, no tie. Corporate but approachable, the kind of outfit that said money without flaunting it. His tattoos remained hidden beneath custom tailoring, though the edge of one crept just past his collar if you knew to look for it. Dominic waited in the lobby, invisible to casual observers but positioned to intervene if needed. Edward didn't expect trouble, but 20 years of survival had taught him to prepare for every contingency. Sarah Robbins arrived exactly on time. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of tired eyes that came from working 2 jobs while raising a child alone. She wore slacks and a blouse that had been nice once but showed the wear of too many washings. Everything about her spoke of dignity maintained through exhaustion. Edward stood, extended his hand. "Ms. Robbins, thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm, brief. She didn't smile. "Mr. Thompson said you wanted to meet in person. I assumed that meant you're not actually Thompson." "Smart." Edward gestured to the chair across from him. "Edward Castellano. I'm the principal behind the offer my attorney presented." He watched her process the name, saw the moment it clicked. Her eyes widened fractionally, then narrowed with something between fear and anger. "You're the man from the square." "No." The lie came smoothly. "But I was informed of the incident. I make investments in community stability, Ms. Robbins. What happened to your son represents the kind of systemic failure that concerns me." Sarah sat slowly, never taking her eyes off him. She had the wariness of a woman who'd learned not to trust easy answers. "You don't invest in community stability, Mr. Castellano. You orchestrated the destruction of 3 families in less than a week." Her voice was quiet, controlled. "The Marcusos, the Gardners, the Haynes family, all connected to boys who bullied my son. All suddenly facing federal investigations and organized crime connections." Edward's expression didn't change. "You've been following the news." "I'm a mother. Following threats to my child is my job." She leaned forward, and Edward saw the steel beneath her exhaustion. "So let's skip the corporate facade. Why are you really here?" The directness surprised him. Most people danced around confrontation with men like him, using euphemism and implication. Sarah Robbins apparently lacked either the knowledge or the inclination to be cautious. "I told you, I invest in stability." "Bullshit!" The word came out flat, matter of fact. "You're connected." The man in the square moved like someone who breaks people for a living. The way those families collapsed, that wasn't coincidence, that was precision. "And now you're offering me $500,000 to disappear with my son." Her eyes locked onto his. "You're either protecting something or eliminating a threat. Which is it?" Edward felt something shift in his assessment of her. He'd expected gratitude, perhaps some questions, ultimately acceptance. Instead, he was facing someone who'd looked past the suit and the lawyer and the corporate pleasantries to see exactly what he was. "Both," he said finally, deciding on a truth that wouldn't expose too much. "Environments where vulnerable children are targeted represent instability, Ms. Robbins. They create unpredictable variables, desperate parents, escalating violence, public attention. I have investments in this community that benefit from order. The situation involving your son was disorderly. I corrected it. By destroying people. By exposing criminals who were already breaking the law." Edward's voice remained level. "Vincent Marcuso was laundering money and evading taxes. Gardner was embezzling campaign funds. Haynes was compromised by gambling debts. I didn't create their crimes. I simply ensured those crimes had consequences. Convenient consequences. Perfectly timed consequences." "Yes." The admission hung between them. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, and Edward had the uncomfortable sensation of being dissected by someone far more perceptive than her circumstances suggested. "You have tattoos under that suit," she said suddenly. "I can see the edge of one on your neck. Prison ink, if I'm guessing right. And your hands, those aren't hands that push papers." She gestured at his knuckles, where old scars formed white lines across tanned skin. "You're not a businessman, Mr. Castellano, or at least that's not all you are." Edward said nothing. Confirmation would be dangerous. Denial would be insulting her intelligence. Sarah looked down at her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, softer, but somehow harder underneath. "I won't take your money. Ms. Robbins, I won't take charity built on someone else's destruction." She met his eyes again. Those families, whatever crimes they committed, however terrible they were, they had children too. Kids who are now facing the consequences of their parents' actions. I won't build Carlos's future on that foundation. Edward felt genuine surprise for the first time in years. You're refusing $500,000 and a safe relocation because of principle? I'm refusing blood money because I won't teach my son that safety comes from destroying others. She stood, and despite her size, she suddenly seemed to fill more space than he did. Carlos needs safety, Mr. Castellano, but he needs a mother who maintains her integrity more than he needs money I can't explain, or a house I didn't earn. The Marcuso family has connections, Edward said quietly. Vincent might be in custody, but there are people who'll view you as a loose end, people who won't care about your principles. Then I'll deal with that when it comes, but I won't become someone I'm not, just to feel safe. She moved toward the door, then paused. Whatever you are, whoever you really are, thank you for helping Carlos that day. But we don't need saving. We need the world to be less broken. She left before Edward could respond. He sat alone in the conference room, staring at the closed door, experiencing something he hadn't felt since his father's funeral. The sense that he'd fundamentally miscalculated. Sarah Robbins had refused the solution he'd engineered because the cost, moral rather than financial, was too high. She'd seen what he was, understood the violence implicit in his protection, and chosen vulnerability over compromise. Edward had spent 20 years believing that power was the only currency that mattered. That protection required the willingness to destroy threats preemptively and completely. Sarah Robbins had just proved him wrong, and he had no idea what to do about it. The deed arrived at Sarah's apartment on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier in a manila envelope with no return address. She opened it standing in her kitchen, coffee growing cold on the counter, and read the legal document 3 times before the words fully penetrated. The Riverside Community Center and Autism Resource Facility, purchased outright. Renovations funded for the next 5 years. Programming expanded to include after-school care, occupational therapy, social skills groups, and family support services. All operating costs covered through an irrevocable trust. And at the bottom, in smaller text, established in perpetuity for the benefit of the community, with special consideration for the needs of neurodivergent children and their families. No name, no signature beyond the law firm handling the transfer. But Sarah knew. She sat down hard on one of her mismatched kitchen chairs and cried, not from relief or gratitude, though both were present, but from the overwhelming recognition that someone had listened. She'd refused the money, rejected the escape, insisted that Carlos needed safety rather than wealth. Edward Castellano had heard her. The community center's grand reopening took place 3 weeks later on a brilliant Saturday afternoon. Someone had strung lights across the refurbished building's facade, and the parking lot filled with families Edward would never meet, benefiting from resources he'd provided anonymously. He stood at the edge of the crowd, dressed in jeans and a plain jacket, deliberately unremarkable. Dominic lurked somewhere in the periphery. Edward could feel his presence without seeing him. The comfort of knowing someone watched his back. The center director gave a speech about community investment and anonymous donors. Sarah stood near the front with Carlos, her son dressed in new clothes that somehow still managed to look lived in and comfortable. The boy's eyes tracked the crowd with less anxiety than Edward remembered from the square, his body language more open. Progress. Measurable, observable progress. Edward watched from his distance as the ribbon was cut, as families poured into the building to explore the new sensory room, the expanded library, the therapy spaces that had been professionally designed for children who experience the world differently. He should have left then. The work was done, the investment made, the instability corrected. There was no tactical reason to remain. But something kept him rooted to his spot on the sidewalk. Carlos emerged from the building 20 minutes later, clutching something in his small hands. He paused in the doorway, scanning the crowd with that particular focus Edward recognized, looking for something specific, not willing to be distracted until he found it. Their eyes met across 30 feet of concrete and celebration. Edward's instinct was to leave, to disappear back into the anonymity that had protected him for 2 decades. But Carlos was already moving toward him, navigating through clusters of adults with single-minded determination. The boy stopped 3 feet away, looking up at Edward's 6'3" frame with an expression of complete seriousness. He held out his hands, revealing a small die-cast car, red with racing stripes, the kind of toy that cost $3 at any drugstore. "This is for you," Carlos said simply. Edward stared at the offered gift, his mind racing through calculations that suddenly felt inadequate. This wasn't a transaction. There was no angle, no leverage, no hidden cost. A child was offering him a toy car because children shared things they valued with people they trusted. "Carlos, I can't." His voice came out rougher than intended. "You helped me." Carlos pushed the car forward insistently. "When the big kids were mean, you made them stop." His eyes, dark and earnest and completely without guile, held Edward's. "My mom says when people help you, you say thank you. So thank you." Edward's carefully constructed armor, built from 20 years of violence and calculated brutality, cracked. Not dramatically, not with any external sign, but he felt it fracture somewhere deep in his chest, a place he'd thought was dead tissue, scar over scar over scar. He knelt down, bringing himself to Carlos's eye level, and accepted the small red car. His hands that had broken bones and pulled triggers and dismantled lives, closed gently around the cheap toy. "You're welcome," he managed. Carlos smiled, a pure, uncomplicated expression of satisfaction, and then turned and ran back toward the building, already distracted by something else requiring his attention. Edward remained kneeling on the sidewalk, holding a $3 toy car, and felt something very close to breaking. Not from sadness or regret, but from the sudden recognition of how far he'd traveled from anything resembling innocence, and how Carlos's simple gesture had illuminated that distance with brutal clarity. "Mr. Castellano." He looked up. Sarah stood a few feet away, her expression unreadable. She'd watched the entire exchange. Edward stood slowly, slipping the car into his jacket pocket. "Ms. Robbins, you didn't have to do this." She gestured toward the community center, its windows glowing warm against the afternoon. "The center, the programs, any of it." "Yes, I did." They stood in silence for a moment. Two people from entirely different worlds, connected by a child neither had expected to be the bridge. "He's doing better," Sarah said finally. "Carlos, he sleeps through the night now, talks about his day without me having to pry. He's making friends." Her eyes found Edward's, and he saw that she'd fully catalogued what he was: the violence, the darkness, the capacity for destruction. And somehow, inexplicably, she'd chosen not to fear it. "You gave him that, not with money, with this." "I corrected an instability," Edward said, falling back on familiar language because he had no other framework for what he felt. "No," Sarah's voice was gentle but absolutely certain. "You protected a child who needed protecting, and you asked for nothing in return." She took a step closer, and Edward forced himself not to retreat. "I misjudged you. In that conference room, I thought you were offering a transaction, but this..." She gestured again at the center. "This is a gift, to Carlos, to all of these families, without conditions." "I'm not a good man, Ms. Robbins." "I know." She said it without judgment, simply stating fact. "But you did a good thing. And you did it the way I asked, by creating safety, not by destroying everything around us." She paused, then extended her hand. "Thank you. From a mother to whatever you are. Thank you for seeing my son as worth protecting." Edward shook her hand, the gesture formal and inadequate for what was passing between them. Sarah's grip was firm, her eyes direct, and in that moment Edward understood that he'd received something far more valuable than gratitude. She'd given him absolution he hadn't known he needed, from someone who had every right to condemn him. Sarah released his hand and turned back toward the center, where Carlos had reappeared in the doorway, waving for her to come see something. She waved back, then looked at Edward one final time. "He'll remember you, you know. Not as the man who scared away the bullies, but as the person who gave him the car. That's what children remember, the small kindnesses, not the grand gestures. She walked away, leaving Edward alone on the sidewalk as the celebration continued around him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the red car, turning it over in his hands. The paint was already chipping slightly. The wheels barely turned. It was worthless by any objective measure. Edward held it like it was made of glass. Dominic materialized beside him, silent as always. He glanced at the toy, then at Edward's face, and had the wisdom not to comment. "We should go," Dominic said quietly. "Yes." But Edward remained motionless for another moment, watching through the community center's windows as Carlos showed his mother something that made her laugh, as other children ran through spaces that would be safe and supportive because Edward had made them so. He'd spent 20 years building an empire on fear and calculated violence, believing that power was the only currency that mattered. That protection required the willingness to destroy anything that posed a threat. A child had just thanked him with a $3 toy car, and somehow that felt like the first real thing Edward had owned in decades. He slipped the car back into his pocket, turned away from the celebration, and walked toward his car. Dominic followed at a discreet distance, understanding that some silences required space. As they drove away, Edward's hand remained in his pocket, fingers closed around cheap metal and chipped paint. He would keep it, he realized. Not as a trophy or reminder of a successful operation, but as evidence that somewhere beneath the scar tissue and calculated brutality, something still recognized the value of innocence. And perhaps, just perhaps, still remembered what it felt like to be worth protecting. 1 year later, Edward sat in his Manhattan penthouse office as winter light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the city below into a study in steel and shadow. The room reflected the careful curation of a man who understood that environment shaped perception. Leather furniture, abstract art that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, technology integrated so seamlessly it became invisible. And on his desk, next to quarterly financial reports and encrypted communications devices, sat a small red toy car with chipped paint and wheels that barely turned. Dominic had questioned its presence exactly once, 6 months ago. Edward's silence had been answer enough. Now the cleaning staff had standing orders never to touch it, and visiting associates had learned not to ask about the cheap toy occupying prime real estate on a desk where billion-dollar decisions were made. Edward picked it up absently, turning it over in his fingers while reviewing the latest territorial reports. His organization had expanded in the past year, new investments, new partnerships, strategic acquisitions that had strengthened their position across 3 states. But there had been changes, subtle ones that his lieutenants were still adjusting to. The first came 3 months after the community center opening. Edward had been reviewing potential expansion into a manufacturing district when his research team flagged something in their due diligence. The area's schools had documented patterns of systemic bullying, with administrative response ranging from inadequate to actively complicit. Edward had canceled the expansion. "Sir," his CFO had protested, "the projected returns are exceptional. The liability concerns are minimal." "The environment is unstable," Edward had replied, using the language that had become his shorthand for something he didn't fully want to articulate. "Instability creates unpredictable variables. We don't invest in unpredictable variables." The second came when one of his street-level operators was arrested for assaulting a high school teacher who'd reported gang recruitment targeting vulnerable students. Edward had personally ensured the operator received no legal support, no organizational protection, no pathway back into the family. "New rule," he'd told his assembled leadership during the next quarterly meeting. "No business operates in territories that harbor systemic cruelty toward the vulnerable. Schools, community centers, social services, these are off-limits for intimidation, recruitment, or leverage. Anyone who violates this will be cut loose immediately." The room had been silent. These were men who'd built careers on exploiting weakness, who understood that vulnerability was opportunity. "Boss," one of the older captains had ventured carefully, "that's going to limit our operational flexibility." "Then we adapt." Edward's voice had carried the weight of absolute finality. "Power means nothing if it only protects those who already have it. We don't prey on children. We don't corrupt the institutions meant to support the defenseless. That's the new mandate. Anyone unclear can find other employment. No one had argued. Now, a year later, the changes had filtered through the organization like water finding new channels. They'd lost some people, operators who couldn't or wouldn't adjust to the new parameters. But they'd gained something else, a reputation that distinguished them from competitors who operated without boundaries. Edward's organization was still ruthless, still criminal, still built on violence and calculated intimidation. But it had limits now, lines that wouldn't be crossed regardless of profit. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Dominic. Annual report from Riverside Community Center attached. Thought you'd want to see it. Edward opened the attachment. Attendance up 40%. Waiting lists for therapy services. New partnerships with local schools to provide early intervention support. A photograph showed the building's expansion, a new wing funded by the same anonymous trust, dedicated to serving families who couldn't afford private services. Another image showed children in the sensory room, including one boy Edward recognized immediately despite the year that had passed. Carlos was taller now, his face less pinched by anxiety. He was laughing at something another child had said, completely unguarded. Safe. Thriving. Edward stared at the photograph for a long time, the toy car warm in his palm. He'd built an empire on the principle that power was the only currency that mattered. That protection required the willingness to destroy threats preemptively and completely. That sentiment was weakness, and weakness was death. A child had handed him a $3 toy car, and every certainty he'd constructed over 20 years had revealed itself as incomplete. Real power, Edward had learned, wasn't just about destroying enemies. Any thug with a gun and willingness to use it could destroy. True power, the kind that lasted, that meant something beyond quarterly profits and territorial expansion, came from creating sanctuaries that couldn't be touched. Spaces where the vulnerable could exist without fear, protected by forces they'd never see or understand. Edward Wallace, crime boss and architect of systematic violence, had found the one thing he would defend with absolutely everything he possessed: the right of children like Carlos Robbins to be safe. Not because it was profitable, not because it provided leverage or strategic advantage. Because a small boy had looked up at a brutal man and offered him a toy car as payment for kindness, and that gesture had illuminated the chasm between what Edward had become and what he might have been if the world had been different. He couldn't change his past, couldn't undo the violence or erase the blood on his hands, but he could ensure that other children, vulnerable, targeted, defenseless children, would grow up in a world where power occasionally protected instead of predated. The intercom buzzed. "Sir, your 3 p.m. is here." Edward set the car back on his desk, precisely positioned next to his financial ledgers. The juxtaposition was deliberate: billions of dollars in criminal enterprise, and a $3 toy that had somehow become his most valuable possession. "Send them in." As his associates filed into the office for another meeting about expansion and acquisition, Edward caught Dominic's eye. His chief of security stood in the corner, as always, and the slight nod he offered carried recognition that neither man would ever voice aloud. They'd built something new this year, not legitimate, not redeemed, but fractionally less corrupt than it had been. An organization that still operated in shadows, but had learned to protect certain lights from being extinguished. It wasn't redemption. Edward was realistic enough to know he was damned regardless, but it was purpose. And for a man who'd spent 2 decades operating without anything resembling moral foundation, purpose felt remarkably close to peace. The meeting began. Discussions of territory and profit and strategic positioning flowing around him with familiar rhythm. Edward participated with his usual precision, making decisions that would affect thousands of lives in ways both visible and invisible. But his hand occasionally drifted to the toy car, fingers brushing chipped paint, and in those moments, Edward Wallace, ruthless crime boss, architect of destruction, man who'd transformed trauma into empire, allowed himself to believe that somewhere in the calculations of power and protection, he'd finally found the one equation that balanced. A boy was safe, a community was stronger, and the brutal man who'd made it possible would defend that sanctuary until his last breath, asking nothing in return except the knowledge that somewhere, innocence still existed. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. Thank you so much for watching this story. If this video touched your heart even a little, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me keep creating stories that inspire, heal, and remind us that kindness still exists in this world.